Welcome. My name is Gitte Heij, and I'm the chair of the executive board of Capabuild. Capabuild Foundation aims to assist tax authorities in developing countries with training, skills development, building up expertise and knowledge, and really focuses on training tax administrations. But tax is not an island. It has a lot of stakeholders, not only the stakeholders of today, but also the stakeholders of tomorrow. Therefore, we are very happy to participate in this program. As you will see, the program is slightly different than you may expect. We are trainers at heart. And when we train, we share knowledge. And when we share, we learn. The best way to learning is doing. So we want today ask you a lot of questions about your views, what you think possible solutions are for tax policy in the digital era. We have a number of short presentations, and we ask you every so often during this 1 hour presentation to go to our poll of questions. We want you to fill in certain questions so we get a better understanding of what you would like to see, what your ideas are, what you see as the major barriers. Then we can use that in the following session as well as in the panel discussion. We all learn together. That is key. The program is outlined as follows. We first talk about the current situation. And let's not forget, the agenda is set by the OECD. We need new ideas. We can talk a lot about the problems. We do that in the first part of this hour. But then we need to move to new grounds. This is a new world. And 19th century solutions or 20th century solutions are not right for the current era. We need lots of new ideas. And that's what we hope to do together. So we move first through the major challenges, and then we move to possible new ideas. Some people have already gone there and have come with quite radical ideas. But it can even be much more radical. We must move away from the agenda setting by the former colonial powers, whose power is actually phasing out. A new world is coming, and Asia will be a powerhouse. What would you like to see in your ideal tax system? That's where we move towards. We look forward to the panel discussion, and we look forward to your answers in Poll F. Thank you.
Greetings and welcome to the Capabuild and Percasa training on digital tax and taxation beyond the OECD. My name's Gary. I am going to take you through today how to use Pollev, which is our way of collecting your thoughts, your ideas, and your discussions. So we will use Pollev quite regularly today, and I'll be asking you to pause the YouTube video every now and then, and just to answer one or two or sometimes more questions on Pollev. So the URL that you'll need is this one, pollev.com/Capabuild. And what you do is you put that into a new window. So you can open that up and put that in, and it will take you to this page. And what I would like you to do now, what we would like you to do is to start the survey. So we'll ask you to do 2 questions to start with. And the first one is what you see as the major problem of the digital economy in general. Now, we're going to be talking about this and you're going to be watching videos as you go through, but we'd like to collect your ideas now. Once you have clicked one, you click on that answer that you believe, and then go to next, okay? And it will bring you to question 2, which is asking for how you are feeling after listening to our chair, Gitte, and her thoughts on what is required in this new frontier. So you can choose one of these and then click on next, but then go back to the YouTube presentation, and we'll let you know again when we'd like you to give us your thoughts and ideas. So remember, you need to pause the video now and put in pollev.com/Capabuild and answer just questions 1 and 2. Thank you.
Taxes. Nobody likes to pay them, but everybody does. Right? Well, not exactly. The fact is that today, digital companies pay much less tax than traditional businesses, even when they make the same profit. How come? Because under today's rules, a company can only be taxed on the profits it makes in the country if it is physically present there, and not if it only does business there through digital means. This is not fair to other businesses. Digital companies benefit from the same advantages and infrastructure as traditional businesses: high-speed internet, roads, and a stable legal system. But often, they don't contribute by paying their fair share of taxes in the countries where they do business. So, is this really your problem? Well, yes, it is. In fact, you are losing out too, because taxes also pay for education, healthcare, and transport. So unless all companies pay their fair share, governments can't provide these important services to their citizens. It's time to change the rules. That's why the EU is working on a fairer tax system, one that supports innovation, but also makes sure that all companies, digital or traditional, big or small, contribute to society.
I've always liked American wines better than French wines, even though I don't drink wine. But the American wines are great.
If you managed to catch President Trump's Oval Office remarks in the summer of 2019, you might have wondered what turned the president into a wine critic. Here's what did it.
France's plans to tax digital giants like Google and Facebook.
The French government is hoping that this will raise 500 million euros in revenue.
The Trump administration has threatened to impose tariffs as high as 100% on a range of French goods.
Sparkling wine is on the list. You see cheeses, you see makeup, you see handbags.
France put on a tax on our companies. Wrong.
France, in July of 2019, passed legislation for a digital services tax. It's a 3% revenue tax on very big tech companies.
Isabel Gottlieb has been following the global effort to modernize the tax system for Bloomberg Tax. She says to understand how we got here, you have to go back a century.
For basically the last 100 years, we've had a series of domestic laws and international agreements that form the system by which multinationals are taxed.
Under this system, companies have traditionally paid taxes where they have a physical presence. In order to sell shoes or lumber or quilts, a business needed to have warehouses, storefronts, and workers in a location. That brick-and-mortar infrastructure provided a legal basis for nations to tax businesses. All that has changed. In today's world, where multinational companies can reach anyone with an internet connection anywhere on the planet, it's getting harder for countries to track who's doing business with their citizens.
You can be based in one country and show targeted ads to people in another country or sell things to them without actually having a physical presence in that jurisdiction itself, in that country. Increasingly, countries are taking their own steps to try to get tax revenue from big tech companies.
France is one of a handful of countries turning to digital service taxes as a new source of revenue. Or, as France's finance minister puts it,
we want to have the taxation system of the 21st century for the business model of the 21st century.
So just how do these taxes actually work?
French tax, it's a 3% revenue tax. Whatever revenue you're making from activities connected to French users in a certain number of ways, you're paying tax to France on that.
That means, even if a company posts a loss, it will still have to pay the digital service tax on the revenue connected to a particular jurisdiction. That's just one of the reasons tech companies hate digital taxes.
The second issue they have with it is logistical. They say that this measure requires them to keep track of where people are, who's looking at their ad, where they are when they see it. And this is a problem that's annoying when it's France asking you to do it. But if you have a dozen countries, 24 countries, even more, it becomes a compliance issue, a real one.
It's like that old shampoo commercial.
Tell two friends, and they'll tell two friends, now you got it, and so on, and so on, and so on.
Facing the threat of a trade war with the US, France ultimately put a hold on collecting its digital tax. But only if the international community can find a solution by the end of the year.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, is working to try to find a solution to digital tax that everyone will agree to.
The OECD has largely settled on a two-pronged approach.
Pillar 1 is an attempt to reslice the pie, if you will, to change how much tax ends up in the jurisdictions where multinationals are doing business.
The second pillar would require multinationals to pay at least a minimum tax rate, the goal being to limit the race to the bottom among countries vying to have the lowest rates. But there hasn't been agreement yet on what that rate would be. For its part, the US has signaled significant concerns with the OECD's plan. The pressure is now on all parties to come up with a consensus solution by the end of 2020. But the coronavirus pandemic has made an already ambitious timeline even harder to achieve.
You'll hear OECD officials, US Treasury officials, other governments talk about there's the OECD solution, and the alternative to that is not status quo. The alternative is chaos. The alternative is every country acts in its own best self-interest.
As tasters for our prize.
In the meantime, you might want to start stocking up on French wine while it's still affordable.
They really liked it a lot.
Greetings all, it's me again, Gary. Just to remind you that we've now got a Pollev questions for you to answer. In fact, we have 3. So if you can pause the video in a moment and head back to pollev.com/Capabuild. Hopefully you've kept that tab open. And we're going to ask you to answer question 4, which is a true or false, whichever you think. We're also going to ask you to answer question 5. Do you think that these proposals, Pillar 1 and 2, will be approved and implemented? We are after your ideas, what you think is going to happen. And then this idea here is which option you think will produce a fairer system. So, time to press pause and come to these answers.
Hi everyone, welcome to this video recording with a very interesting guest. The guest today is Stef van Wegel. Stef is a global policy leader at PwC in Amsterdam. He's also a professor in international tax law at the University of Amsterdam. And last but not least, Stef is the chair of the supervisory board, or better, the board of trustees of IBFD. Stef, as we can see within the OECD context at the moment, issues are no longer technical, but more and more politicized. And the pressure is building up as COVID-19 crisis is worsening. So how do you navigate yourself through this political minefield? And to what extent do you allow yourself to be political or have political beliefs?
Yeah, in a way, the answer is embedded in the answer I just gave to your first question. So we will, in this tax policy, in my tax policy team, not take political positions. We really try to think from the system as a whole. What makes sense? How does the international tax architecture lead to the least distortion of the system? How would it facilitate avoidance of double taxation, but also make sure that it's a coherent system that is acceptable to other parties? Now, I guess we will get to that later in the interview, but I find the current situation incredibly worrisome. I have been practicing for 35 years now, both as a lawyer in the tax policy role, but also I've been engaging with the OECD. I have had for 20 years my role as professor of international tax law at the university. Never in all those years have I seen so much tension in the system. It's the pressure from society and the distrust that is building up in society towards business. It's the distrust towards aggressive tax planning. It's tax competition between countries, but also in the context of the current project, we'll talk about that, of course, the digitalization of the economy. It's the perception by the United States that other countries are after the revenue that would otherwise end up in the United States. It's countries that have different opinions as to how the architecture of this project, Pillars 1 and Pillars 2, would happen. I will not, talk too much about that because I know you have another question about that specific.
Yeah, Steph, it brings me to you already mentioned some aspects, but let's talk a bit about digitalization, digital taxation. And I want to begin with a quote from you. Let's say almost 2 years ago at an IFA Congress in Seoul, you said the international tax world is in crisis. And I think nowadays it is fair to say that the global situation is at least chaotic and that the international tax system is broken. For instance, there are outdated rules, stemming from a brick and mortars economy, while today intellectual property is very important, also against the background of taxation. You have a lot of tech giants who don't have physical presence in a country, but a lot of users. What we see is also the malfunctioning of the at arm's length standard. Base erosion and profit shifting is still going on, and we have an unstable global tax governance. And Steph, because we have viewers who are not really tax educated people, these are high government people, I think if you allow me, let me sum up some of the issues to set the scene for our viewers. For instance, we see more and more countries have introduced rules to tax tech companies. For instance, Indonesia recently with a significant economic presence, PE, and the electronic transaction tax as a backup. What we also see and what we have read is that the ATAF, the African Tax Association, said that we should not wait any longer and come up with our own measures. If you look at the US says, the digital service tax, it's a breach of tax treaties because in effect, the DST is an income tax, which falls within the scope of tax treaties. And you are also breaching non-discrimination rules, including in trade agreements, because the US says DST, digital service tax, is a tariff. And the US is threatening with countermeasures in the form of trade tariffs. For instance, look at the tense situation between France and the US. Another development is that the US Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, in his June 12 letter to the G4, he withdrew from the OECD Pillar 1 reform proposals. And on top of that, the US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, he expressed his frustration in blunt terms, and I quote, "The inclusive framework all came together and agreed to screw America." Another thing is that if we look at the EU recently announced that it is ready to take measures to tax tech companies if the OECD does not achieve a global consensus on how to tax digital activities. And last but not least, we see in the relation between China and US, there is a trade war, and it seems to be developing into a Cold War. So this is a bit setting the scene for our viewers, and the questions related to this development is, Steph, where are we heading? What is your view on these developments in connection with tax and trade, and what would be the best way forward? Let's start with that.
Yeah, well, so the short answer to your question, or towards the end of your intervention, the question is the future is not looking very nice right now. I think that we will continue to struggle and have an unstable and perhaps even chaotic situation. So to go back to the IFA Congress that you referred to 2 years ago in Seoul, when I said, the international system is in crisis, Pascal Saint-Amand, the director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD, was sitting next to me, and he agreed, and he also suggested that he literally said, "I am agnostic as how we will solve this, as long as we find a solution." With that, he touched on the core of the issue. The whole international tax system, historically, for the past century, as we developed it, has been based on the allocation of taxation rights to a country, depending on mostly the activities of people. And that was logical. If if a business wished to expand in another country, you needed people in that other country. So it was very logical to look at the sustained presence and activities of those people, and then decide if there is such a presence, that country will get part of the taxing rights of the profit, regarding the profit of that business. And that's how it developed. But then, of course, today, with the digitalization of the economy, the popular phrase is scale without mass. It's very easy for a business to participate in the economy, to penetrate in the economy of another country without any people. So you see that must have an effect on the tax base of that country. Is that a problem for policymakers, for governments? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It depends on the trade balance and the kind of products and services that are exchanged between countries. If there is an equilibrium in the trade, let's assume that both countries import and export the same amount of services, let's say digital services, maybe it doesn't matter. But of course, if there is an imbalance, if a country is a net importer, has a large market, but maybe not much production or rendering of services, then it could really affect the revenue basis in that country. But even apart from the real revenue at stake, there is political pressure, because the perception with society, with non-governmental organizations, with politicians is that the large digital companies make money in a country. Quite often the difference between making money and generating revenue that could be loss-making as well, that difference, that distinction is often lost in the let me call it rhetoric. So there is pressure building up to tax these digital players because the perception is they escape all taxation. So that's, and of course, and that explains the remark by Mr. Lighthizer in the United States. Everyone is going after the United States. Well, as it happens, the largest digital companies in the are in the United States. So it's logical as a result of the sheer size of these companies and their presence in the US that the US perceives this as the rest of the world. The inclusive framework is going after the US. Now, why is the situation so unstable? Because, as you mentioned, countries are introducing unilateral taxes, digital services taxes, equalization taxes, what have you. And given the pressure that countries face, that is understandable. The OECD and the inclusive framework, the G20 for that matter, behind that, very well understand that some chaos could result from this. So they are working on a redesign of the architecture. But then, of course, the redesign is technically very challenging. There is the question which countries are winners and losers, the impact assessment. There is the vested interests of large multinationals. There is this other part to the project called Pillar 2, which calls for a minimum taxation everywhere. Some countries are in favor of the redesign, but not in favor of the minimum tax. Some countries say we only want the whole package. If there is to be a minimum tax, that can only be if there is also this redesign. The United Kingdom is such a country. There's China, which is a huge economy, and then there's the US. That they have not really pulled out of the project, but at least they said let's pause for now. And then there is the enormous technical complexity. Even if you get agreement, how to put that agreement in a legal framework that works with existing bilateral income tax treaties, with probably the need for another multilateral convention. So the challenges are enormous. And as the project lingers on without conclusion, more and more unilateral measures, DSTs, will originate, will pop up, and that will inevitably result in responses by the United States in the form of tariffs or otherwise. So it's the word or the term trade war has been used quite a bit. I think this is nothing short of a trade war, and from all I see right now, it's going to get worse before we see improvement, because this inability to reach consensus. And I know that the OECD and the inclusive framework are working very hard right now on blueprints for both pillars, and they are hopeful we'll get some consensus by the fall. The G20 will meet November 21, 22, and perhaps there is still a possibility for consensus, but right now I find the situation very, very unstable.
What Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 may do for Indonesia. Right now, I do not know if it's good news or not such good news for Indonesia. It's very difficult to calculate how much benefit Indonesia will have from the introduction of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, because not all the data is available. So we make an assumption that it's good news. We also make an assumption that logic will prevail. But as But John said so rightly, it's political. This is not about the technical details. It's about politics. We may make an assumption that Joe Biden will be more sensible than Donald Trump. That's highly unlikely because Joe Biden will defend the tech industry in his country the same way Barack Obama did. That means that a consensus is very unlikely to be achieved. The alternative is 10 times worse. Everyone agrees on that, but that doesn't mean logic prevails. So there is definitely a thinking that it may reach agreement. It's very likely it will not. What will the global south do? How can they put more pressure on this? India is really muscling in, and I think that's fantastic from a political viewpoint, and I'm not a political scientist, but to see how countries who previously may not have had that much power now see increasing power and exercise their rights. And that is very positive. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Heij. And Pa Andrew, you can answer the question, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot of things to take into account and try and balance here. I mean, first of all, you know, let's get to an agreement first before we talk about the timing of Pillar 1, Pillar 2. We still got a long way to go there. And, you know, people are more or less optimistic about whether that's going to be possible or not. I think, though, I mean, the question asks, is this the right time? And I think if we can get to agreement, yes, it is the right time. And it's the right time both because, you know, look, we see a lot of tech, you know, digital companies benefiting greatly from the situation, the current situation, and in circumstances where revenue is very tight, you know, maximizing the taxing power for those companies, particularly for emerging markets, for developing countries, will be very, very important. But second of all, you know, the consequences of no agreement and a rise of unilateral measures will almost certainly bring with it the rise of retaliatory measures and tariffs, and we already see the U.S. Trade Representative launching investigations, including in Indonesia's case, and so those actions. I mean, I think we can predict if there are unilateral measures, there will be unilateral retaliatory measures as well. And so, you know, as well as measuring the benefit of Pillar 1 for Indonesia or any other country, you also have to measure the kind of counterfactual, well, what if we don't get agreement? What will that cost? What will a DST bring in revenue? What will it cost in terms of trade or uncertainty or what have you for multinationals? So there are a lot of things there. I mean, I think I want to touch a little bit on the corporate tax. I know Professor Heij mentioned it a couple of times about kind of the end of corporate tax, and I think that's something that people should think about, or particularly think about the role of the corporate tax and what it means. And it's not a monolithic thing. In OECD countries, oh, and I have to correct Professor Heij. There are not 36 members of the OECD. We're 37 now. Colombia is officially a member, so we're getting more and more inclusive at the council level. But corporate tax for OECD countries is fairly, you know, a modest amount of overall tax revenue. It's about 9 or 10% of total tax revenue. But for developing countries, emerging markets, particularly developing countries, a much higher reliance on corporate tax revenue, you know, up to 30, 40% in some countries. And so the variable for different countries and different economies is much, much different. So if you talk about the end of corporate tax in the UK or Canada, well, that's one thing. The end of corporate tax in Nigeria or Kenya is something completely different. And so how that balances out and what it's replaced with is a real concern. But in that regard, like, I mean, I think, and some people have asked about, well, you know, if we have to, you know, relieve tax to keep the economy going, but we got to collect more revenue to pay debt. What do we do? It's an impossible conundrum, and it is, you know, pay for healthcare, pay for all these things. I mean, I think that one of the things, one of the great benefits of the international tax work over the last decade, and the benefit that the G20's focus on transparency and cooperation has brought to all countries, OECD member, non-OECD member, is the ability to collect taxes wherever taxpayers keep their money. I mean, 10 years ago, when I joined the OECD, the idea that you were going to get bank information from Switzerland was a fantasy. I mean, it just was not on the horizon. And today, you know, Switzerland, Singapore, Panama, Hong Kong exchange information all over the world, and Indonesia is a great beneficiary of that under automatic exchange of information. And our latest numbers say that countries have exchanged information on 84 million financial accounts with an account value of over 10 trillion euros, which is it's a big number no matter how you cut it. And I think so maximizing the ability of jurisdictions to tax capital, whether that's through corporate tax or through direct taxes on shareholders, has changed considerably. And I think countries are going to have to look forward to exploiting these abilities to tax things more and more. You know, as the reliance on corporate tax, whether it goes away or it's diminished. I mean, Pak John just showed us how the corporate rate in Indonesia is falling. It's falling all over the world. So we're going to have to pick that up, and the more we can track capital around the world, I think it's better for all countries. So I hope we get agreement. We always have in the past, but if we don't, I mean, I think countries are going to have to prepare for the chaos that people have talked about. And I think personally that if there is chaos, that countries will be driven back to the table, but it will take some time. And in 3, 4, 5 years, MNEs will say, we can't do this. We can't do business in this environment. We need a global consensus. So let's try again. But there are many possible futures.
Welcome to session number 2 of the Prakarsa webinar, Global Tax Policy on Digital Economy. My name is Paul de Haan of Capabuild Foundation, and together with my colleague Gitte Heij, we will take you through some of the main aspects concerning the global tax policy and where we are at the moment, and maybe have some future scenarios in there as well. On that future scenario, on October 12 this year, notably Pascal Saint-Amand, the big tech chief of the OECD, said that up till now there was no consensus on a multilateral solution concerning the problems of the taxation of digital companies. But as Pascal Saint-Amand argued, the glass was half empty and half full, because there was, in his view, a solid foundation for a future agreement. I think he's too optimistic on this point, because there are some immense barriers for a multilateral solution to be reached. First, there is the political barrier that in order to reach a solution, countries, especially the United States, which has a lot of tech companies, as you know, Google, Amazon, what have you. First of all, the United States, for instance, should give up its taxing right to a big part of the profits they use to tax within the United States itself. Secondly, there are huge technical problems in the execution of a multilateral solution. There is this two-pillar approach. Pillar one is, so to speak, to rearrange the allocation of profits made by tech companies in such a way that market jurisdictions have more possibilities to tax that so-called excess profit of tech companies. And clearly that will bring about a lot of technical details. How do you calculate the excess profit? What is the mechanism you use to have market jurisdiction actually tax that part of the profit? And pillar two, the minimum tax, the global minimum tax should also be introduced by various countries, by various states in the world. And how are you going to do that? And how do you avoid that there are different mechanisms and different rules? And how do you avoid that companies are paying double taxation on the same amount of profit? I think these are huge challenges for a multilateral solution to be reached. So I think it's safe to say that the chances of getting a multilateral solution are not very high. And I think we should realize that if no consensus can be reached within the OECD, particularly in the inclusive framework of the OECD, I don't see any other organization doing this. It's not a coincidence that the G20 in 2013 and 2014 asked the OECD to come up with a consensus for the international tax policy, because I don't think there is another organization, not even the UN, capable of getting a consensus. So if within the OECD there is no consensus reached, I think what we end up with is chaos in the international tax world. It means that countries will seek unilateral solutions and that business will be confronted with a lot of issues and a lot of administration and a lot of double taxation. So I think the future is not looking very bright from that perspective. Needless to say that in such bleak scenario, things will definitely not improve for developing countries and emerging markets. And I think then it will be time for all those countries to reflect on their position and also look for stronger alliances in order to counterattack the chaos then arising in the global tax policy. On that, I'm afraid, pessimistic note, I'll leave you to watch the program, and please also fill in the Poll F questions on this situation, because we are very curious on your views and your opinions on this. And I look forward to, together with Gitte, to be in the panel shortly and answer questions and exchange views and opinions on this very, very interesting and fascinating topic. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak.
Hi there all, it's Gary again. Time for Polev. So hopefully you've got your polev.com/Capabuild tab open. And for question 7, we want to know what you think is a better way of creating a fair digital taxation system, and explain in your own words, write as much as you like. You must there click submit once you've entered your response. So click submit first, otherwise your response won't be recorded. Then go on to next. Choose which alliance will have the greatest influence. And then question 9, we want you to rank what you think the top 10 economies in 2030 will be in 10 years' time. So you can choose, if you think Germany will be number 2, you can move Germany down to number 2 or number 3, and similarly with Russia, all of the countries. So there's 10 nations here, and we'd like you to put them in the order that you think they will be in terms of the size of their economy, then submit the response, and then go on to next.
Today's emerging markets are tomorrow's powerhouses. According to a recent forecast from Standard Chartered, countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, and Egypt will all be moving up the economic ladder over the next few years. But before we get into future growth, let's look at where things stand today. China recently edged out the US to become the world's largest economy by GDP when adjusted for purchasing power parity. India, Japan, and Germany will round out the top 5. Let's look at how this is expected to change by the year 2030. China's GDP will continue growing. Even accounting for a natural slowdown given the economy's size, the country may still end up with an economy twice the size of the United States. Already, 5 of the 10 largest companies in the world are located in China. India will shift up into second position. Some of this growth will be fueled by rapid urbanization, as many of the world's fastest growing cities are located in India. Indonesia's economy is expected to triple, surpassing the size of India's today. The country's capital, Jakarta, is projected to become the world's biggest megacity by 2030. With 3 countries in the top 5, Asia's slice of the global GDP pie will increase to 35%. Egypt is expected to rocket up the rankings from 21st place to 7th by 2030. The country's rapidly increasing population will play a big part in this economic growth. Germany is expected to remain in the top 10, but at the bottom of the list. While the country is likely to remain the dominant economy in Western Europe, its modest growth rate will see it fall behind more populous, rapidly developing countries in Asia. This is a trend that will likely play out across the world as the divide between the developed and the developing economies continues to close. Theoretically, a country's share of global GDP should eventually converge on their share of global population, a trend we see reflected in this forecast. By 2030, 7 of the world's 10 largest economies will be located in today's emerging markets. As this shift occurs, Western economies may need to adjust to new realities on the global economic stage.
But what they do want us to tax, and they say it's okay and good and wonderful and beautiful to tax, is everything above that. You can tax as much true economic rent as you want. You can tax it theoretically at 100%. Why? Because it's in effect a windfall. Not really, not quite, but it's in effect, it's above the quasi rent. It's partially due to dumb luck or opportunity, and it's non-distortion. If you tax that, you're not going to distort anything because everybody's already moving into your investment at maximum to get that quasi rent, and everything else is just a bonus, so you can tax it away. So the trick is you've got to figure out how to start taxing true economic rent without touching quasi rent. And so that's why there's like a mix there, and we don't know where to draw the line to make sure we're on the right side of that. And I can see in the discussion about digital services taxes, about global excess profit taxes, about wealth taxes, and I understand wealth are individual, not corporate, but as they go through the corporate form, capital. All of this discussion is really a fight about, well, when are you taxing economic rent, quasi rent? We don't want that. That's going to depress investment, and you're going to kill the economy, and you're going to hurt, you're punishing success. And when are you taxing true economic rent, which is not punishing success, because true economic rent is not a result of effort, it's a result of chance. And so taxing it is not distorting it. So there's a lot of, hand wringing and line drawing and imperfect, trying to balance around that, around those two categories. And then finally you get this windfall, which I've just sort of thrown off the chart in, glorious abandon. Where is it? It just fell out of the sky. You guys know that windfall, it's about like, you can't cut down a branch, but if the branch falls down on you, then you can pick it up and go take it to the market and sell it. And that's why they call it a windfall. That's the pandemic, right? You didn't ask for it. Nobody wants this. This isn't great. It's terrible. But some people are going to pick that branch up from the pandemic and go sell it, and they are selling it, and they're making a windfall. And guess what? They're going to do that all because they get all of those returns up to the windfall. They don't need the extra windfall profits. They don't need them to do the thing, to pick up the branch and go. They don't need to do that, to do the things that they're doing to make money in the pandemic. So we should tax that all away. We should tax it all away any way we can, because they're not going to change their behavior in order to keep that profit. This is the economist's view, I say. Okay, so then I'm just gonna, you see the little boxes now that say routine and non-routine? Yeah, good. So then I'm just gonna connect this up to the OECD Pillar 1 scenario, right? So what is going on? They're starting to talk about routine and non-routine, and you see them using the words normal and abnormal in some cases, and people are talking about, what is the risk-free rate and what is the above risk rate, and all. You see these words getting bandied around in this discussion about what should we do about the taxes of certain firms that seem to be off the charts in terms of how much profit they're making. And I would argue that we've drawn a line somewhere, and some people are worried we've drawn it right down through quasi-rent. Some people are really worried about that, and so they're pushing back. And some people are worried, well, you're probably taxing true economic rent, but guess what? It's not your rent, it's my rent. It's not the rent of Europe, it's the rent of the US. I want it. You don't get to tax it, it's mine. And I am not indifferent to that tax, because it's not whether it gets taxed or not. The taxpayer doesn't care, but I care as a government because it's my endowment or somebody else's endowment. And so this line is starting to get drawn somewhere, and wherever it gets drawn, there's going to be some unhappiness and discord. But the question is not whether the line gets drawn in the wrong place for firms. The firms might be indifferent if you manage to stay above quasi-rent. You just leave quasi-rent out of it. You get that line farther along so that it's just hitting the windfall or the true economic rent. Maybe the firms are indifferent, but governments are not. They're not indifferent because they have to share that. They have to share that endowment. All right, so this is where my thinking has brought me so far. It tells me that, when you ask, well, the idea here is we're supposed to tax income where value is created and business activities take place. Well, value is created in all kinds of surplus profit type of ways, where more than one interested party contributing to the bottom line. And business activities occur wherever the law says they occur in some cases. And that's the problem. That is a problem, that we respect those ideas. We respect those categories. And that's got us to this place where we're trying to figure out what to do about all this stuff. So how can we accurately count? You see my little slide that says we can't in the middle? How can we accurately count value in the international tax system? Sorry, we can't. We can't. So should we give up? No, right? Maybe we can do a little bit better than we did before, because we're in a moment. We're in a constitutional moment. If you talk to Steve Dean, who's on the call, we're in a existential shift. Yeah, we're in an existential shift. If you ask Ruth Mason, who's, I think I saw her face in the call, right? So maybe we can do better, maybe a bit better than we did before. Steve Dean talks about a moment of reckoning in his paper on the constitutional moment, and I think that's right. That's right. We're at a moment of reckoning. Now, COVID, he wrote the paper before COVID-19 hit, and he's, I think, adjusting it to take this into account. So I think we'll hear from him eventually. But COVID-19 I think plus the digital tax disagreement creates a moment of reckoning. It's exposing all these fault lines, inconsistencies, and weaknesses. It's a moment where we can actually see there's political will to change, and now's our time, tax lawyers. It's our turn. We have to take all these concepts that the economists have laid out, and they're confusing and they're interesting and they're not always straightforward and they don't all agree with each other, but this is our moment to say these are all the piece. The piece that we're trying to reckon with is that actually you can't separate value. You can't take something that is the product of multiple inputs and then accurately count it out. So therefore, it's a political decision. It's a political decision that actually meaningfully impacts everyone on the planet, right? And so it's going to matter. The thing that's going to matter the most is not where is value created and not what is an excess profit or a surplus profit or an abnormal or whatever super profit. It's not that, but where is it? It's all that's going to matter is who's at the table to decide when that thing gets divvied up. And that thing gets divvied up.
Hi there, it's Gary again. We've just got 2 questions for you now. So back to polev.com/Capabuild. You can answer question 10, put what you think. And question 11 also is just a 1-word answer. So if you can pause now and head over to Polev.
Thomas Piketty, you say that an 80% tax rate over incomes of $500,000 wouldn't reduce the growth of the American economy. It's a bit of a leap of faith, isn't it?
Oh, maybe it should be above 1 million or above 2 million. But look, I'm not here to make predictions. I'm here to try to put these issues in historical perspective. So what we've had in the past, is a very diverse set of experience in terms of tax policy and inequality and growth. So for instance, in America, in the United States of America, on average, the top marginal tax rate between 1930 and 1980 was 82%. Over a 50-year long period, sometimes it was 90, somewhere it was 70, but if you make the average over this 50-year long period, this was 82%. Now, this applied above $1 or $2 million of annual income, typically, so very high income. And I guess this is the reason why, apparently this is not destroy American capitalism. So, and in fact, if anything, growth rate, productivity growth rate, innovation, as far as it delivers productivity growth rate, was higher before 1980 than it has been since then. So, I think we should try to have a quiet debate about these issues. 80% tax rate would be a disaster if you were to impose it on everybody above 200, above 1 or 2 million.
Above 200.
200,000 pounds or $200,000, but above 1 million or above 2 million, the historical evidence suggests that paying a manager's 10 million instead of 1 or 50 instead of 10, it's not that useful. So above a certain point, you just don't see in the data the extra managerial performance that you would like to see.
This is a chart of the wealth of every single American household. That includes cars, houses, yachts, jewelry, and even cold hard cash. It also includes things we owe other people, like student loans. So let's take a quick tour of American household wealth. We can start over here, where we see people who owe way more than they have. As we move further right, we can see, oh, that's me. And there's my doctor, who owns an expensive home. And there's former heavyweight boxer Mike Tyson. But when we get to the very richest people in the world, oh hey, it's Beyonce. We can zoom out so far that this chart looks like a stick, and we still can't see the top of their wealth. Because these people are so much wealthier than the rest of us. In other words, this chart doesn't just show wealth, it shows the staggering wealth inequality we have in America. But recently, politicians have been talking about an idea that's never been done before in America. To even out wealth, we should tax it. In January, Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed something called a wealth tax. This was a big deal. Because this doesn't typically get taxed. Most of the taxes we pay only happen when money changes hands, like when we earn money or spend money. But according to Warren, here's the problem with that. This bar represents my wealth, and this is my friend's wealth. I think he owns a yacht. But because both of us have the same job and earn about the same amount of money, our income gets taxed about the same.
Two people who may have the same income, but are in wildly different economic circumstances.
So to fix it, Warren wants to tax the actual wealth people have, but only for the very, very rich. Here's her proposal. All the wealth above this line, $50 million, would be taxed at 2% each year. All the wealth above this line, $1 billion, would be taxed at 3%. So if you have $40 million, you'd pay nothing. If you have $60 million, you'd pay nothing on your first $50 million, but 2% on the $10 million after that, or $200,000. And if you have $2 billion, you'd pay about $49 million. So what would happen if we imposed Senator Warren's tax? Well, only the richest 0.05% of Americans would pay this tax. But in 2016, the government could have raised about $200 billion from it. That could pay for a plan that makes public college tuition free 3 times over. It could pay for all federal food assistance programs, like food stamps, 2 times over. It could get close to cutting child poverty by 60%. These are massive programs that would help millions of people. And what makes that possible is the huge amount of wealth stuck here at the very, very top with the ultra rich. A wealth tax hones in on that. We've started this paid membership program called Vox Video Lab. When you sign up, you support our journalism, but you also get access to some really cool exclusive content. So you can join at vox.com/join. And thank you.
China is getting serious about fighting environmental pollution. As of January 1st, the Asian superpower has introduced a new tax aimed at reducing emissions. The tax varies according to the quantity and toxicity of pollutants emitted and whether the emissions affect air or water. Businesses have to install automatic monitoring devices and share emissions data with authorities. Even before the emissions tax, our company's environmental departments have begun to monitor the density and amount of 24-hour wastewater and emissions of air pollutants. China's rapid industrialization, coal dependence, and booming car industry have led to some of the worst pollution on the planet.
We thank you so much for your attention and your energy today and the responses you've already put into Polev, which we'll be using to inform what we talk about next week when we are back with you. We've just got a few final questions. We have question 12, 13, 14, which is about your ideal tax system, and you can fill in as much as you like there. And 15 and 16 are all about the role that ASEAN can play in the future. And once you're finished there, you can click finish. And then your responses have been submitted, and we look forward to reading them. Thank you very much.